So it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. David Snowden. Been following his work for a few years now, and we were able to implement some of his framework at School of Infantry West. So for the Marines, you've probably already seen some of the fruits of his framework. So he's the founder and chief scientific officer of Cognitive Edge. His work is an international in nature and covers government and industry looking at complex issues relating to strategy, organizational decision-making, and individual decision-making. He has pioneered a science-based approach to organizations drawing on anthropology, neuroscience, and complex adaptive systems theory. Recently, he is engaged with the Navy Warfare Development Center and their commander. He was the guest speaker of this year's Navy Reserve Flag Officer Training Symposium. He was invited by the commander, Navy Center to Safety Center to speak at the inaugural Five Eyes Safety Symposium. And most recently, he was the Secretary of the Navy's Strategic Readiness Review Team. In addition to Dr. Snowden, we have escorting him Brian Ponch Rivera. He is a reserve officer, and in his off time, he's the CEO of AGLX Consulting and the commander in the Navy Reserve. As a consultant, Ponch exports military leadership and teamwork lessons to organizations interested in improving safety, resilience, and agility. Commander Rivera recently served on the Secretary of the Navy's Strategic Readiness Review Industrial Best Practices team, responsible for identifying leading practices in the fields of human factors, safety, culture, assessments, and organizational change management. And we have Zin Go with us as well, who is on the Cognitive Edge team, and she is a sociologist by training. She has conducted research in the areas of cultural studies, theory, economic sociology, urban planning, organizational studies, sociology of intimacy, and environmental sociology. So we have a lot of experience, but Dr. Snowden, really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to talk with us, and look forward to this conversation on an operational approach to complexity. Thank you, sir.
Thanks. It's always a pleasure to come to Quantico, so it's nice to be back. If anybody wants to interrupt or ask a question or even have an argument, feel free. I really don't have a problem with that, right? So if we can get some dialogue going, that's fine. What I want to do is talk a little bit about the theory side of this and then talk about the practice. And the idea is to speak for about half an hour, 40 minutes, then that you pick it up, all right? So that's the plan. Yeah. The origins of this work, although they go a fair way back, my first degree is physics and philosophy as a joint major, which was kind of like an indulgence when I did it, but has proved quite useful since. But it meant I was trained to have a contempt for social science from two completely different disciplines, and I really haven't shaken it off since, all right? So the approach I've had, it started with John Poindexter in the Genoa 2 project in DARPA, which I worked on for about 5 or 6 years before and after 9/11. Where we were looking at human factors in weak signal detection. So this is to give you the context. John had 2 projects. One was TIA, which is the one which got him into all the trouble with Congress. Yeah, total information awareness. The other was Genoa 2, which was my group in Merlo Park, which was human factors. And we were basically saying human intel is as important as machine intel. And we need to recognize the two are complementary. So that was kind of like the origins of this work, yeah? And it sort of developed on and built from there since. So that's kind of like the background. So what I want to do is to go through some kind of like 101 stuff from natural science, because what we developed over the past 20 years now is to say you can't trust empirical approaches in management science. So you can't use cases. Doesn't mean you can't learn from cases, but you haven't got enough data to form conclusions. And there are a whole body of cognitive biases and all sorts of other things which come into play. The main problem you see is the confusion of correlation with causation, which is a real problem in social science. And the illustration I always give, if America wants to increase the number of Nobel Prizes, all you have to do is increase dark chocolate consumption. Because Nobel Prizes per head of population directly correlate with dark chocolate consumption per head of population for the last 30 years. So there's an obvious pattern to do, go eat chocolate, Nobel Prizes will go up. The other one I love is, suicides by drowning directly correlate with the release of Nicolas Cage movies, but I can see a sort of causal pattern on that. So there's a whole site of these, and it's an indulgence to go on to them. So what we decided to do, and remember we're dealing with conditions of extreme uncertainty if you're looking at weak signal detection, where you get in novel patterns, and that's where we move into what I'll explain later as abductive research. You haven't got enough stability, so even if you do understand the cases, the context is shifting so rapidly, you have to have a different approach to create coherence. That's one of the key words here. So what we use natural science as a constraint. So there's things we know about systems, there's things we know about human cognition, so those provide a constraint structure, and then you develop methods and tools that work within those constraints, and that gives you a degree of predictability. And otherwise, what would be uncertainty? And some of them are quite scary. So this is my favorite one, which I use a lot. This is from a book, well, it's a paper by another group of guys. They also wrote a book called The Invisible Gorilla, which was produced by the cognitive neuroscience community to basically explain why Malcolm Gladwell's Blink is probably one of the worst books ever published, all right? Do not tell anybody who's a real scientist you take it seriously, you won't be invited out for dinner again, right, in that sense. So this is radiologists. Now radiologists, and it's a key concept here, it's generations of knowledge. So if you look at the IT profession at the moment, they're coming off 1 or 2 generations of body of knowledge. Whereas if you look at, say, doctors, they're coming off 70 or 80 generations of knowledge, right? And what happens as you get more and more generations through is certain types of knowledge transfer get hard baked into the system. And it's quite an interesting when you see in medical research, which is replicated in military. So in medical research, nurses acquire practical experience, then acquire theory, whereas doctors acquire theory, then acquire practical experience. And you can see the same in sort of NCOs against officers, right? It says balance of 2 different types of knowledge base, which actually seem to be critical for sensing, because you get different orientations. Certainly some of the work we've done with NCOs, for example, is NCOs are often closer to the cultural issues within a corps than any officer, in terms of the way they deal. So they're primary source of data. So this is from radiologists, 4 or 5 generation body of knowledge, dealing with a limited data set. So you give them a batch of X-rays, and on one of the X-rays you put a picture of a gorilla in plain sight, which is 48 times the size of a cancer nodule, and you ask them to look for anomalies. And 83% don't see the gorilla, even though their eyes actually physically scan it. And the scary thing is the 17% who do see it come to believe they were wrong when they talk with the 83%. Now this is not something you can train yourself not to do. The only people who always see the gorilla are fully autistic. And of course they can't operate because they're having to scan too much data. So to give you some of the basic facts behind this, the most you scan anybody in this room with the available data is about 5%, and that's on a good day if you're really focused. Most of the time it's 2 to 3%. Your visual range, actually you only have about 0.01% in sharp focus at any one time, in terms of the way you're scanning. And the way you make a decision is based on a partial data scan, is you do a first fit pattern match with your own and indirect experiences. So a radiologist has 20 to 30,000 patterns in their brain, their body, their social interactions, and their tools. It's a distributed function across all of those. And the most frequently used ones will be activated first. So based on a partial data scan, they do a first fit pattern match, not a best fit pattern match. And that's how you all make decisions. Now, there's actually interesting differences. If you're Chinese, the scanning ratio doubles. We actually think this is linked to the different requirements of language groups. So in Mandarin, you can't say anything precisely. You have to understand the context. So if you show Chinese students a picture of a tiger drinking from a stream in a forest, they'll see the forest and miss the tiger, whereas American students will see the tiger and miss the forest. And that actually does account for a lot of foreign policy differences as well. It's an object context focus difference in terms of the way things work. If you give a bunch of American students a batch of objects, they'll talk about the biggest objects. Chinese students will talk about the relationship between the objects. So they think in terms of relationships, not context, right? So there's a lot of interesting stuff here. Yeah? But the key thing is you will only scan a limited amount of data. Now, in evolutionary terms, you can see why this happens. If you think about the early hominoids on the savannas of Africa, something large and yellow with very sharp teeth runs towards you at high speed. You know, do you want to autistically scan all available data? Yeah, look up a catalogue of the flora and fauna of the African veldt, and having identified lion, look at best practice case studies on how to avoid being eaten by lions, right? By that time, the only document of any use to you will be the book of Jonah from the Old Testament, which is the only example I've found of how to escape from the digestive tract of a large carnivore, yet written by a purported survivor, right? So we evolved to make decisions very, very quickly based on a partial data scan privilege in our most recent experiences. Yeah? Another example on that, my father was a veterinary surgeon, which is why I became a theoretical physicist and philosopher, right? If you spend puberty going out on Welsh farms doing sheath washings in freezing cold weather, being laughed at by Welsh farmers, you do something else for a living. But he spotted rabies in a quarantine centre a day before a dog was to be released. If you don't know, we quarantine animals on entry to the UK. And rabies was manifested in a non-typical way. So he spotted it. And that saved the country a fortune. We have a simple policy: if we get rabies in the wildlife population, we kill every mammal within a 1 mile radius of the outbreak. Yeah, human beings are exempt from that. The vets actually don't really agree with that. They think it's a bad containment policy, but they've learned to live with it. Right? So the cost is very high. Yeah? Now I remember asking him, I'm 13 or 14 at the time, and I said, well, how did you spot it? He said, well, first of all, he said, I've seen rabies. Most actual British vets haven't. Yeah, he served in the Royal Army Veterinary Corps in the war. He served in Afghanistan. He served in Egypt. He saw a lot of rabies. Yeah? He said, but I wouldn't have spotted it if I hadn't been telling you the story about the rabid jackal hunt the night before. So it was on my mind when I went in there. Yeah? Now that phrase, on my mind, I heard in virtually every interview we did in the CIA or NSA around successful weak signal detection. It wasn't a structured process, it was actually luck. Yeah, not only somebody happened to spot something because of based of something they were thinking on, which was nearly always lucky, but they also could get somebody's attention, whereas a lot of the times they couldn't. So part of what I want to talk about is how do we manage for serendipity? How do we find the 17% before they talk to the 83%? Yeah? And that's kind of like critical, particularly in joint ops. Because of course in joint ops, everybody has their own filtering mechanism, so they're going to see work in very different ways. Yeah? So kind of like, just hold this one because you can't avoid this. Yeah? Learning to live with it is more important. And actually in evolutionary terms, we evolved to make decisions as clans, not as individuals. Yeah, we actually evolved to do collective scanning, and so-called educational deficiencies are actually part of cognitive diversity. Yeah, you need some people with mild Asperger's syndrome, you see some people with mild dyslexia, because they perceive the world in a different way. Yeah? One of the things we're now starting to do is to map cognitive and behavioral diversity in organizations as a measure of resilience. Because if you don't have diversity, you haven't got the ability to respond to uncertainty, and that's quite an easy thing to do once you get into it. So that's kind of like key fact number one. The other one is complexity. Now, I'm told you've all seen Cynefin, or you've seen some of the videos. I always get embarrassed if people have seen the videos. I try not to watch them myself. But I'll just give you the basics so we've got a common sense. There are three types of system which exist in nature: complex systems, chaotic systems, and ordered systems. Now, this is a new field, so we don't have complete agreement on the language. So you will find some people use chaos where I use complexity and so on. That's characteristic of a young field, right? So I need to use my definitions. Yeah? And I also lead a field which is called anthrocomplexity, which says that complexity in human systems is radically different from complexity in termites' nests and bird flocking behavior. Human beings have altruism, intelligence, intentionality. There's a whole body of things which makes human systems more complex. And as I keep telling colleagues in Santa Fe, you know, human beings aren't ants. But they don't like that because then their models don't work. Yeah? So kind of like we want to work around that. So an order system, I'm going to define it by constraints and come back to that in a minute, because one of the key ways we operationalize complexity is we map the constraint structures in play and determine where we can change the constraints. And I'll explain that in a minute. So if I have a tightly constrained system, then the system is ordered because it's the constraints make everything predictable. And you can see good examples of this. You can see it with doctrine, for example. Yeah? You can train people to do things in a fairly routine way. Yeah? We also see it in operating theatres. So these days we count the number of surgical instruments left at the end of an operation and check it's the same as was there at the start. Yeah, and as I get older, I find this sort of thing of increasing importance. I know the figures on how many people had to have a second operation, and it's in double figures before they did this. Yeah? The trouble is people think they can translate a process which works in an operating theatre into day-to-day life. And everybody forgets the training which goes into making the operating theatre work. And the scrubbing up process isn't just a matter of making your fingers clean, it's also a cognitive activation pattern, so it triggers an identity switch from whoever you are to whatever role you have. Which, by the way, we now know uniform does as well. Yeah, when you actually don uniform, it creates a cognitive switch which changes the way you think. So the work we've done with the Singapore police is they don uniform for some meetings and not for others, because they literally scan the world in a different way. Yeah, ritual is one of the most important things in human sense making. And you need to build rituals which actually enable cognitive diversity. Yeah, it's not something you put rules and regulations, you create rituals and physical rituals which change the way that people think. So that's something you might want to think about because it has implications. One of the big things we did in safety in New Zealand, we halved accidents in truck drivers by getting them to strap on a heated belt before they unloaded the truck. Something like 80% of the accidents were happening in the 10 to 15 minutes after they landed at the harbour and unpacked the lorry, because their cognitive pattern was a driver pattern. They'd driven for 200, 300 miles, and it was taking 10 or 15 minutes for the brain and the body to reset for loading, and that's when the accidents happened. So by giving them heated belts and having a simple rule, you must strap on the belt before you do anything, we actually knocked the accidents down, I think 2/3 of the accident level, because it was a rapid cognitive switch. Yeah, and that's the use of ritual in safety, which is more effective than rules. Yeah? So ordered systems have value, but they take a huge amount of effort to create. Yeah, and the trouble is you can't translate it. Another example on checklist, we were working with BC Hydro. So these are guys who maintain power lines, all right? And it's probably not as hazardous as some of your lives, but for 5 months of the year they have to wear masks because the air is so cold that they die if it gets into it. And for another 5 months of the year there are more grizzly bears per acre than there are people. So, you know, they're either going to be eaten or freeze, all right? Apart from 2 wonderful months in spring and fall where life is good, right? So what used to happen is they get together on a truck when a power line was down. They'd all smoke a cigarette and they'd mentally they'd talk about the job. Then some idiot of a safety consultant came along and couldn't cope with the socially evolved process, so he made it a checklist. What then happens is the foreman looks at the checklist and said, we've done this, haven't we, lads? Ticks the boxes. They don't do the mental rehearsal, and they had 5 critical deaths that year. Yeah? And this, I call it the tyranny of the explicit. Yeah, the belief that something isn't real unless it's been written down is actually really dangerous, yeah, in a whole body of areas. Yeah? So, well, that's ordered systems. They have value, but they're dangerous if they don't. A chaotic system is one without constraints. Now, this is where language differs by group. I'm using it without effective constraints, which means if it happens accidentally, it's a disaster, but it doesn't last for long. Yeah, somebody will create some structure fast. If you can deliberately create it, then it's an innovation space or it's a decision support space. Yeah, so I'm going to come back to that later, because if you can create a system without constraints, you've got novel discoveries that you can't have if the constraints are filtering data. Yeah? And a complex adaptive system is one with what are called enabling constraints. Yeah? Now, this is a key concept. I always use a marine example, so I hope you guys still do this, all right? Napoleonic warfare, one of the brilliant things that Napoleon did was to issue a simple heuristic: if in doubt, march to the sound of the guns. And that actually revolutionized warfare, because up to that time everybody waited for a runner to come from the general, or if they fancied it, they tried to do something to see if they could, you know, they disobeyed command, you know, fog of war and all that sort of stuff. Yeah? Now, what March the Sound of the Guns did is it allowed a self-organizing capacity around a heuristic. And the marine example, which Gary Klein still always quotes, so I believe Gary, is capture the high ground, stay in touch, keep moving. So if you don't do it anymore, I think you should do it, but it's a brilliant example, because you can train anybody to do that if the battlefield plan breaks down, and it creates an organizing principle. And to give another illustration of the importance of this, many years ago, my daughter was kind of like this high and charming. She's now this high and charming, but writing critical essays about my misuse of Deleuzian epistemology. This is, it's kind of like, can we please go back to puberty? It was less scary, all right, in that sense, right? So anyway, she's very young. She'd almost run off the Irish ferry when we came back from a holiday. So I've now got her in a safety harness with one of those extendable dog leads. And her mother doesn't approve of this. I find it eminently practical because I can reel her out and reel her back in again, all right? And we climb up to the top of Conwy Castle in Wales, which is one of the English castles, And to be honest, we're playing father-daughter tricks, which is a bit naughty, really. So, her mother is scared of heights. She's got the baby brother down there. So I hold on to the harness and we literally lean over the castle wall and wave, all right? It's perfectly safe, all right? And there are screams from below, and this is classic father-daughter. We're enjoying ourselves, all right? And then she drops her fluffy toy rabbit. I hadn't realized it was in her arms. Drops down 20 feet and lands on a ledge, right? Now, this is the rabbit without which we cannot sleep at night. You know those rabbits? Yeah? I am now in deep shit. Not only will I be blamed for it, but on my deathbed, the family will remind me of the day I lost Lisa. My family has very long memories on negative stories, and they're going to enjoy this one too much. So I couldn't deal with it. So my hobby then was climbing, all right? From a climber's point of view, a castle wall is nothing. It's vertical. It's got handholds, for God's sake, all right? Normally you don't have it. So I tied it to the flagpole with a dog lead. Went over the castle wall, climbed down, collected the rabbit, climbed back up, all right? Got a wonderful hug when I returned the rabbit. I still remember that hug. Untied, I went down to be met by the entire Conwy police force, who finally got a crime, all right? And was escorted into the police station, but luckily they were fathers too, so sooner or later Eleanor got spoilt rotten and it was tea and biscuits time, right? Now, when I went over the wall, I knew I was breaking the rules. So I was paying attention. And I started to repeat myself, and I still remember this, I'd forgotten it, but I learned, I started to say 3 points of contact, 3 points of contact, 3 points of contact, which was drummed into me when I learned to climb on the Idwal slabs at the age of 11 or 12, but I'd forgotten since. But it came back, and I was never safer because rule breaking was exceptional and I was following a heuristic. And that's one of the ways we actually manage complexity, is we create heuristics that people follow, accepting a degree of failure. So if the rules don't work, you follow the heuristics. And that's called an enabling constraint. The other thing about a complex adaptive system is everything is connected with everything else, but you don't know what the connections are. And we have a concept called a dark constraint, which is a reference to dark energy in cosmology. You can see an effect, but you can't see what's causing the effect. So the essence of a complex adaptive system, the most critical thing to understand, is a complex adaptive system has no linear material causality. So there are no root causes. A complex adaptive system is dispositional, not causal. Now, interestingly, that's quite easy to explain in Southern Europe, China, Asia, or Africa, because the religions there have not lost the concept that some things just are. There's no particular reason for them to be. This is the way things fell this time. Whereas, of course, in the Western tradition, ever since Kant and the Enlightenment, we've got this belief in causality, but it's been quite useful. But realizing you're dealing with a non-causal system is critical, because it means you have to manage the dispositional state so that good things are more likely to happen and bad things are less likely to happen. But every state is a different state, and that requires a different type of agility.
Yeah, but doesn't complex adaptive system have characteristics like education, economics, culture, or?
It has characteristics, but they're dispositional characteristics. So the same thing will only happen again the same way twice by accident. That's the general rule. So the example I always give is, how many people have heard the children's party story? Okay, right. Okay, this is my normal illustration, right? So the basic principle here, and this is, You know, the stuff that, I mean, US Army uses and everybody else. So fundamentally what you're looking at is you need to work out which system you're in order to decide how to act. And of course, any system then has to be decomposed to the level of granularity where it fits into one of the categories. Otherwise, you've got a mixed category. So that's a simple decision rule. So the example I want to give is, if you can all imagine you're managing a party for a bunch of 9-year-old kids. Can everybody imagine this? And you're making the mistake of holding it in your own house. This is a fatal error, right? The value of community centres is they have fire hoses. Fire hoses are very useful to clean up after parties and are occasionally necessary for crowd control during the party itself. So I want to look at how you would organise a party based on what type of system it's in. Yeah? So if you assume the system is chaotic, that means there are no constraints, which means the children are free of any inhibition, which means they're going to discover drugs and alcohol and go on a personal experience of self-discovery. You know, your house may burn down in the process, but all property is theft and it was socially constructed in the first place, so why are you worried about it? There's a stiletto in that for some academic colleagues. I don't recommend this. I've got a friend in California who tried it once. He'd just come back from Burning Man and had this belief in spontaneous self-organization, which he discovered translates into spontaneous combustion when you let kids loose in your own house. All right? So I don't recommend this, but that's the chaotic approach. Right? The ordered systems approach, on the other hand, you'd be reasonably familiar with. Yeah? Under this, it's of critical importance to agree learning objectives for the party in advance of the party itself. The learning objectives should be aligned with the mission statement for education in society to which you belong, and should be clearly articulated in memorable phrases and printed off on motivational posters with pictures of eagles soaring over valleys and water dropping into ponds. And you should place the posters around the room where you're holding the party. As the children come into the party, they're given Disney playing cards with the party value system printed on the back of it, so they're aware of that. And of course, you produced a project plan for the party. The project plan has clear milestones throughout the party against which you measure progress against ideal party outcome. And the senior adult starts the party with a motivational DVD. You don't want the children wasting time in play which isn't aligned with the learning objectives. Then you use PowerPoint to demonstrate their personal commitment to the party objectives and to demonstrate to the children how their allowances are linked to the achievement of the milestone targets. Following the highly successful completion of the party, you conduct the after-action review, update your best practice database on party management, and mandate future process improvements. If at this stage, for any reason, the children aren't happy, you hire an appreciative inquiry practitioner who will get them to tell happy clappy stories if they have happy mental frameworks, and suitably indoctrinated they like whatever you put in front of them next time. Everybody reasonably familiar with this approach to party management, right? There's a Navy postgraduate school version of this in a Platonic dialogue you can get as well, which is even funnier. Right? The complex systems approach, on the other hand, is much simpler, and excuse one swear word here, but it's sort of necessary. We start off by drawing a line in the sand, a metaphorical line in the sand, known as a boundary constraint in complexity. And we look the children squarely in the eye, and we say, cross that, you little bastards, and you die. And one of the things you learn pretty fast as an adult is the value of flexible, negotiable boundaries. Because rigid boundaries have a habit of becoming brittle and breaking catastrophically when you least expect it. We then introduce catalytic probes, a football, a barbecue, a DVD, a computer game, in hope a pattern of play forms. If it's a beneficial pattern, we push more children towards it. If it's not a beneficial pattern, well, that's where you actually deploy the fire hoses. So what we actually do is we manage the emergence of beneficial coherence within attractors, within boundaries. And that's complexity management. The only things you can manage are the boundary conditions, the experimental probes, and the amplification or dampening strategy. And I can take that straight back to Clausewitz, in terms of where you go on that. Yeah.
So it sounds like you're containing that complex adaptive system and not necessarily manipulating it.
You may be manipulating it, because the way you understand a complex adaptive system is by experimental probes. And then actually you do experimental probes in parallel, not in sequence. Yeah? And the experimental probes change the dynamics of the system, so the system reveal you. So you may contain it, but you may actually open it up. I'll come back to that on constraint management in a minute. Yeah? Okay. The key thing is to realize there's no point in having specific end goals. And one of the key things we say in complexity is you need a sense of direction, but not a specific goal. Because if you have a very specific goal, you will not spot novelty on the journey which you could exploit. And I just side reference, and I did a lot of work on small group command in Washington not so long ago. And you've got corporals now making decisions which impact on world politics. Yeah, so it's not just a simple warfare issue anymore. It's very small things can have massive ramifications, and we're not training people to minimize risk on that. Yes, sir.
So along those lines, you said earlier that recognizing which of these systems you're in is crucial. If we fail to recognize that we actually are in a complex adaptive system and we try to manage it or inject it or control it,
you have a disaster. Yeah. And actually, one of the things you try and do is you want things to be ordered, but you want the enemy to see it as complex. Yeah, if you can actually create enough structure that you can predict outcome, but the enemy doesn't know how to do that, that's actually a valuable space. Or if you can control the constraint structure, so you may not be able to control outcome, but the key thing is you need to control the probes. Yeah, if the system is complex, you need to be highly active very quickly in parallel, because otherwise somebody else will do it and you won't know to where to look. If you're controlling the probes, you know where to look.
Well, I guess it's your definition of order, right? Because you may see disorder, but an anthropologist may see this is a natural.
Yeah, can I come on to that one in a minute, all right? Because that's the issue about expert knowledge against non-expert knowledge,
Okay.
all right? And when you apply that, yeah? So that leads me on to Cynefin, right? You can have a picture of, that's the top of Glydavawr in Wales, all right? It's quite a nice illustration. You do not want to get lost up there with the dark coming on, all right? It's like I've broken a rib and I had 8 stitches and God knows what up there. They're my home mountains, those. I know they won't kill me, but every now and then they hit me hard, so I know to bear them with respect. Sorry about the superstition, but that's the way it works. So Cynefin as a framework looks like this. And it divides order into 2, where the cause and effect relationship is obvious and where it's complicated. Yeah. Now the difference here is critical because in obvious everybody can see the relationship between cause and effect and everybody accepts it. So as you all know, in civilized countries we drive on the left-hand side of the road. Yeah, so if you're in the UK you drive on the left, if you're in the US you drive on the right, if you're south of Naples it doesn't matter what side you drive provided you drive with confidence, all right? I know how to drive the Orfini coast now and it's based on flocking behavior. It's that Italian drivers have been studied, all right? It's fly to the center of the flock, match speed, avoid collision. If you do that, life is easy south of Naples, all right? But the point is, it's a simple categorization framework. So this is pure doctrine, sense, categorize, respond, and I apply best practice. Yeah? Complicated, on the other hand, is there is a relationship between cause and effect, but it may only be available to an expert, but not to the decision maker. Yeah? Or it may require analysis to discover what it is, but there is a right answer. So here I sense, analyze, respond, and I apply good practice, not best practice. That's actually a really important distinction. We'd make the difference between fixed constraints and governing constraints. Coming back to your point about containment, a governing constraint, say, provided you pass the qualification to go through this barrier, you've got freedom to operate. Whereas a fixed constraint says this is the way you do things. And people often mix those two up and lose credibility as a result. Yeah? You then get a chaotic space where we basically act, sense, respond. You ain't got time to play here. You've got to produce stability. This, by the way, is drawn as a cliff because if you become complacent, you fall off the edge. Yeah, it's actually when you really think you've got things under command. In fact, the last time I was here, I used the Montgomery pattern illustration and didn't realize I shouldn't use army general names with Marines because they wanted me to rename it, but never mind, right? I learned a lesson that day. But actually, Patton is a classic case of a complex adaptive general. Yeah? Whereas Montgomery, everything is planned. Yeah, if you look at Market Garden, it was a disaster because he was over-planning for a highly complex situation and over-committed politically. Whereas Patton in the Ardennes is completely different. He's constantly changing and adapting and experimenting and probing in terms of the way it works. Yeah, so that's a good illustration of that. And in the complex world, what I do is parallel probe, sense, respond. And actually, this is one of the things you actually do is if you've got 5 or 6 people with a coherent hypothesis about what should happen, you let each of them run a small safe-to-fail experiment. And in military terms, a safe-to-fail experiment may involve some people dying, of course. Yeah? But the point is you do small parallel experiments to see what the system will reveal when you explore it. Yeah, and the point about a complex system is it's constantly shifting, it's constantly changing. So practice here, and I'll introduce a new word here, is called exaptive. Now you may not be familiar with this. This is a key concept in evolutionary biology, and it's key to human innovation. So adaptation is a linear evolutionary process. So if you look at a dinosaur's feathers, and oh, by the way, if you've got children who are into dinosaurs and about to give you competitive advantage, all dinosaurs had feathers. Yeah, we're now finding that from discoveries in northern China. Yeah? So basically, feathers evolve in dinosaurs in a linear way, it appears, for sexual display. So we have a breed of dinosaur that develop a flap under their forelimb with coloured feathers on it, and those are the dinosaurs that started to fall off cliffs. And actually, because they had feathers, they glided. Yeah? So flight didn't happen in a linear way, it was a trait which evolved under one context, under conditions of stress, exapts, not adapts, for a different context. And of course then it adapts. If you look at an owl's feathers, yeah, they've now got silencers, yeah, built into them. Yeah? The point is, you couldn't get it instant, you couldn't get it in traditional evolutionary terms, but if dinosaurs jumped off cliffs in the hope of evolving feathers before they hit the ground, they wouldn't get a chance to breathe. Yeah? The cerebellum at the base of your brain evolved to manipulate muscles in fingers. It exapts in humans to manage grammar in language. So the huge sophistication of language couldn't have developed unless there was something which already did something similar. Now, if you think this isn't relevant, in 1945, a Raytheon engineer maintaining the magneto of a radar machine notices that a Hershey bar melts in his pocket, and he realizes the significance. Other people had just had their trousers cleaned. We actually got microwave ovens. Yeah? If you actually go through the history of warfare, the history of technology, you will find major innovation comes by rapid stress-based repurposing. Yeah? And that actually has a major impact on the way you store knowledge and the way you deploy knowledge, because you need to manage things so they can be rapidly repurposed rather than they can be used the way they were originally designed. Yeah? So this starts to create different strategies in terms of response mechanisms. Yeah? So that's basically the Cynefin framework. There's a new version of this, by the way, I haven't got time to go into it, which is the liminal version, which actually creates a liminal domain here and here. Liminality is a key concept in anthropology. It's a state of suspension between states. So tactically, the longer you can hold something here, the less risky it is when you finally move it over there. Yeah, but at this point, you're into a different type of process. This is something I'll come back to in a second. Now, one of the ways we use Cynefin in practice is that actually the way we define it, because we need an operational definition, is the Cynefin framework is normally defined by exemplar narratives. So what we do is we go through an organization's history and we find the narratives that everybody tells everybody else. Yeah, trainer stories are often good ones on these. Yeah, and then you basically use those to define the domains and the boundaries. Because under stress, to say it's like this and we agreed that was complex is a lot easier than to say it's got enabling constraints. That's too abstract. So what we do is we build history into the framework. Now the fascinating thing that you can then do, and this is the fractal version, is you can have different versions for different groups. So I might have one command with one model, but I make sure there are some in common across all groups. Now, one of the examples we got on this is the Tampa Police, right? Because this Naval Postgraduate course school teach this stuff. So they actually had a SWAT team who realized the problem was complex. So they did, having done that, and they did it, the guy scratched the Cynefin framework with a sort of nail on the back of a breeze block. I'm still quite proud of this one. And he said, it's complex, we're going to probe, we're not going to follow standard procedures, and people's lives were saved. But critically, when he phoned head office, he said, it's complex, I'm probing, nobody challenged him. Because they used the framework at that level with a different set of exemplars. And I'll come back to this again more later. It's fractality, you use the same model strategically as you use operationally, because it creates a language of legitimate differences, which actually rapidly increases communication patterns. Yeah? That's particularly important in joint ops because people have their own histories and their own context. Yeah? The one famous one we did with the Singapore government, we took all their ministries and we produced a Cynefin framework with a set of exemplar narratives. Then we sent them away for a week and we brought them back and made them work in their separate ministries rather than in combined groups. We gave them the same data that they'd done to create the framework, which was evenly distributed, and got them to allocate it to the framework a few days later. And each ministry allocated the data in a different way. It's quite fascinating. The defense guys were close to the original. Home Office, so Home Affairs, prisons, police, put everything into the complicated domain because they think in terms of evidence. Foreign Office put everything into obvious because they only write reports after things have happened, so it's always obvious with the benefit of hindsight and so on. And they still got that up on the walls. Because what it basically says is we see it like this, they see it like that. There's nothing wrong with this, but we need to understand those differences. Now, I'm going over this quite quickly. But that's one of the ways we operationalize the system, by embedding it in people's own common narratives, but to allow a different sort of discourse or a different sort of conversation. Now, the other thing I want to go on to, and this I'll stop, is the constraint mapping. I'm going to go through constraint scaffolding and then distributed support. One of the ways you manage a complex adaptive system is you start by mapping constraints. So you don't want people talking about the situation. When the reasons for that is if people do situational awareness, and this is actually, by the way, a red-blue teaming problem as well. If you do situational assessment and you're a human being, you've already decided what the right thing is to do at a subconscious level. And so your situational awareness is that your situational description is biased by a subconscious decision to act. So one of the things we want to do is completely separate the two. So what we do is we say we're not going to talk about the overall situation, we're going to map the constraints. And we have a whole typology of this. There's a critical difference between containment or connection. That's actually fairly obvious. Resilient or robust. Something which is robust survives change until it breaks catastrophically. The example I normally give is a seawall. Seawall is extremely effective until its design conditions are exceeded, where it would be better if it hadn't been there in the first place. Whereas a salt marsh will absorb a huge amount of material, but of course you lose the farming land, so it's a trade-off. Resilience is surviving with continuity of identity over time. A marine from the 18th century wouldn't recognize a marine now. But if you look at the flow of time, there's continuity of identity through constant change, and that's a resilient structure. And then we get scaffolds or permanent. This is work we're doing with Anne Pendleton-Julian, does a lot of work with the seals, with her again tomorrow. What you'd start to do is to say, can we create a scaffolding around which things can emerge? I'm deliberately using a metaphor here. And this is a typology of 5 types of scaffolding, which we're about to roll out as a method. So that's the sort of bamboo scaffolding you see in the Far East. It's far more resilient than steel scaffolding, but there's a training overhead to construct it. But the point is, you know what the building's going to look like. You throw the stuff up quickly, but you take the scaffolding away when the building is there. This one here is a nutrient lattice. So if you have a burn, people will put a nutrient lattice over the burn, which creates a structure for the skin to regrow. And the nutrients dissolve into the skin, so the lattice disappears. It doesn't have to be removed. This one is really interesting. This is a type of fabric which is put into the heart, which dissolves and leaves electrical filaments in the heart to keep it going. So it's different from a nutrient lattice because it doesn't go. It leaves a residual thing which gives you stability. And the kayak one, that's called a shadow constraint, a shadow scaffolding. So that kayaker, if you've ever seen extreme kayakers, anybody do this sort of stuff? They're actually, if you watch them before they go, they're kind of like rehearsing the whole way down with their fingers in the water. But there's a whole scaffolding of practice, technology, training and everything which makes them safe. And if that scaffolding isn't there, they can't do it. And the Keystone one, we're still playing with this one. If you go to Rome, anybody been to Rome? Sorry, there's enough NATO stuff there that you're bound to. So basically, if you look at it, there's the old catacombs with Roman, the Keystone is there, it makes the arch stable. The trouble is people have built on the scaffolding. And if somebody takes away one keystone and doesn't realize the significance, the whole thing will collapse. That's really important if you're dealing with counter-terrorism or civil disturbance, because you may not understand where the keystones are and you may take the wrong sort of action in terms of the way it works. So this is the work we're now doing, which is you start to people focus on constraints and scaffolding rather than structure and outcome. So it gives sufficient coherence around which you can actually map. Yeah? And so particularly important if you're dealing with civil insurgency to start to think about these type of structures, because you want to be able to walk away, you don't want to be there as a permanent engagement. And we're not thinking in those sort of terms, we're thinking in terms of solutions rather than allowing things to emerge. And of course in a complex system, granularity matters hugely. Comes back to your question at the back. You need to get the granularity right. If you deal with things which are too big, you're going to get it wrong. If you deal with things which are too small, you get it wrong. I call this the three bears solution, if anybody remembers the fairy story. Yeah, it's the one which is just right that you want. So getting granularity is right, and that includes things like operating procedures, unit size, and everything else. Yeah, granularity is key. Okay, final thing, and so I want to talk briefly about distributed decision support, then I'll stop. If anybody does risk management or search, you'll be familiar with this thing, which is called a bell curve. Everybody seen a bell curve? Yeah, all God's children love bell curves. Yeah? So if you're doing risk, you basically say, okay, everything here I can discount because it's very unlikely. And what I have to do is cover off stuff here. That's the classic risk model. It's the basis of most computer search algorithms and everything else. Right? It's also the basis on which people produce standard operating procedures. Yeah, they deal with the center of a normal distribution. Now the problem with this, if I do a double log scale of size against frequency of virtually any natural phenomena, then I get a pattern which looks like this. And if I draw the straight line, it looks like this. So it's straight here, it's not straight there, and that's significant. That's called a power law. Now this is a type of Gaussian distribution, this is a type of Pareto distribution, taking some liberties with statistics to make a point. If I overlay one on the other, it looks like this. So I've now got a bloody fat tail. And what that means is I'm going to fail. Yeah, I can't avoid the failure. So the key thing now is early detection, fast recovery. And the problem is, if we create environments, we've got a big problem on this in medical environments. People don't tolerate failure anymore. But if you've got more than a single morbidity, you're bound to fail. And because we don't tolerate failure, because of the legal implications, people don't report failure early enough. So when the failure comes, it's catastrophic. Yeah? Now, this is key because up to this point, the two curves are similar. And what I can do here is I can assess probability. Because I've got a symmetric relationship between what happened in the past and what's likely to happen in the future. Nothing is going to happen in the future which hasn't already happened in some way in the past. And so I've got a many-to-many relationship. So that's good news. I can get that right. As I move to here, kind of like life is now getting more interesting because on that curve I can dispense, I can manage this stuff. But this is where I actually handle anything which is possible. Now the set of things which are possible is bigger than the set of things which are probable. But I've still got symmetry to a degree. I'm starting to get increasing asymmetry. So I've got things that are happening in the future which have already happened in the past, but increasingly they're varying. And I'm getting more novelty in the future, so my uncertainty levels are going up. Yeah, we're now starting to move into the VUCA stuff, though I don't like the VUCA word. I think it's deeply problematic. Right? I can tell you why later if you want. But basically, at this point, all right, this is where I do contingency planning, cone of possibilities, scenario planning, red-blue teaming, all these sort of things. I'm exploring things so I can get ready. Yeah? But up to this time, everything I've done has been based on a hypothesis. So people have hypotheses about what's the right things to do, about what's happening, and that's cool at this point because I've got a degree of symmetry between past and the present. When I move over here, everything changes. I've now got massive asymmetry between the past and the future. So very few things are repeating, and increasingly things are completely novel, which means I've got to deal with anything which is plausible. And now it gets really scary, because it's almost like a geometric growth as it goes through that. And I can't afford to have a hypothesis here, Because if I have a hypothesis, that will blind me to novelty. And this is where we move into what's, up to this point, I've done inductive logic. This is where we move into what's called abduction. So there are three types of logic: deductive, inductive, abductive. So deductive, if A, then B. Inductive, all the cases of A have B. Abductive is sometimes known as the logic of hunches. So what's the most plausible connection between apparently unconnected things? And the good thing is, as a human beings, we're really good at this. The bad thing is it makes us very prone to conspiracy theories. Yeah, because the big problem in induction, this is what we started to address with Poindexter, is how does one person's intuitive insight is more objective than somebody else's intuitive insight. Yeah? So the issue in weak signal detection is not about the fact we know that some people will always spot what's going wrong, but how do you find the people and realize it's significant? So if you remember in 9/11, all right, anybody read the congressional report on 9/11? Remember the final chapter says, why didn't we join up the dots? Anybody heard that phrase? Yeah, we know people being trained to fly but not land. With the benefit of hindsight, everybody sees it as significant. Okay, well, let's look at the dot question. So if I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 dots, I've got 6 linkages between the dots. So 4 dots, 6 linkages, 64 possible patterns. A pattern is a dot or link or any combination. If I go up to 10 dots, how many patterns are there? Numbers, please. Quick guess. Your life depends on it. I want a number fast. 1,000. How many people think 1,000 is too much? Too little? Not answering because you know you're going to get it wrong and you've been on too many courses. Yeah. Okay, it's too little. Anybody want to have another guess?
They told me there was no math on the test.
Sorry?
They told me there was no math on the test.
20,000.
20,000. How many people think he's going too high? Too low? Yeah, you're getting the pattern? Okay, it's just over 3.4 trillion. If I go up to 12, it's 4.8 quadrillion. If you know the story of the emperor's chessboard, a sage, after a reward by the emperor, said 1 grain of rice on the first square of the chessboard and double thereafter. There wasn't enough rice in China. How many dots are there in the human system? How many possible patterns are there? With the benefit of hindsight, everybody can see what pattern we should have paid attention to, but hindsight doesn't lead to foresight. And you might remember the 9/11 report came out at the same time as the second shuttle disaster report. And I remember we had frantic conference calls. I mean, Dennis and I went on the bloody hill on this, but nobody would listen. And we said the first shuttle disaster report says the right information wasn't in front of the right people at the right time, which is what the 9/11 report says. The second shuttle disaster report says everybody had the right information, but the right people didn't pay attention to it. Yeah, and you're making a disaster because putting everything into one agency reduces the diversity of scanning. But nobody would listen at the time, and you can see some of the consequences. Right? So abduction is a key area. So I'll briefly talk about this. This is a couple of things to go into this which are key to understand. One is the role of abstraction. If you don't know it, music and painting come before language in human evolution. It's actually really important. So if you look at Cretaceous languages, they name things, whereas human language evolved from abstractions. Now the evolutionary argument for this is it starts off like an accident. We now know that evolution is survival of the luckiest, not survival of the fittest. Yeah, Darwin hints at that, but reckons that's even more controversial than survival of the fittest, right? So basically what happens is people start to draw things with charcoal, it kind of like works. But then what actually happens is by shifting up a level of abstraction, it allows you to actually invent things. Yeah, that's actually one of the main roles of art in human evolution, because you shift up. If you listen to music, you look at painting, yeah, you go up a level of abstraction, so you disconnect from reality, which means you make novel or unusual connections. Yeah, so abstraction is key. The other thing we want is to trigger what's called autonomic, not novel. We want to trigger novelty receptive processing, not autonomic processing. This is what Kahneman talks about as thinking fast or thinking slow. Yeah, and the only way you can trigger people into thinking slow is to increase the cognitive load so that the conventional approaches don't work. So the way we do distributed decision support, and this is an example of what's called the fitness landscape, what we've done here is we've created an infographic. Yeah, I'll talk about a modern case, but this is an infographic about a future state. We've then got thousands of people to interpret that infographic using what's called high abstraction metadata. Now, just to illustrate that, you've all done some sort of satisfaction survey at some stage in your lives? Okay, so we had these in IBM, and somebody would say, okay, does your manager consult you on a regular basis, scale of 0, not at all, 10 all the time? Does that sound familiar? And I remember phoning up HR and saying, how am I meant to answer this? Yeah, I've got 3 managers, 4 people I take business direction from, 3 very powerful people who I can't ignore. Sometimes they consult me, sometimes they don't, sometimes they should, sometimes they didn't. You're asking a context-free question in a context-specific world. I shouldn't have done that because that confused them. And I should tell you I was on a watch list because I'd actually done a 6-month experimental project which had proved that astrology was more accurate than Myers-Briggs in predicting team behavior, and for some reason they were upset about that because they paid for it, all right? Either way, we don't do that because you know what the answer is, and it's quite interesting. Post-Brexit, post-Trump, we suddenly got listened to because we said nobody's listening to the street stories. You're listening to what people say when they know what answer they should give. You're not listening to what's actually happening on the streets anymore, and we've been working in Libya and elsewhere on this, yeah? The street stories that people tell children are radically different from the stories they tell intelligence officers and analysts. Yeah, I can show you one if you want in a minute. We actually captured 50,000 stories in Pakistan. And what we did is we got children to go into their communities. This was the Foreign Office, and by the way, the Foreign Office hated me at the end of this. The Home Office loved me. So we basically got children to go to people in their the parents' generation, and ask them for the story that the adult thought the child should remember about their community. This was done in a week. And then they interpreted those stories into a series of triangles, and each triangle had positive qualities on it. This is how we create the cognitive load, and it's abstraction. So one triangle said justice in this story is about retribution, revenge, deterrence. Sorry, reconciliation, revenge, yeah, deterrence. Identity is about individual clan idea. Time is past, present, future. So this is an open source database. This is the DARPA work I did. We get 50,000 stories over 4 days, including stuff from the refugee camps when Al-Qaeda were present. So this was some really good stuff. And we were able to draw dispositional maps from that. We did the same in Pakistan immigrant areas in the UK. Now in Pakistan, the index intended towards restorative justice, clan identity, past or present. First generation Pakistan immigrant communities, London, Birmingham, Glasgow, revenge, individual, future. And that was the project which showed that radicalization is going from the UK to Pakistan, not the other way around. As I say, we may be very popular with the Home Office, but very unpopular with the Foreign Office who'd funded it, but that's life, right? So what we're looking at is underlying attitudes or beliefs. This is a peace and reconciliation one, or a multi-agency one. So you present an infographic. We just one of these, I think we just did one of these on NATO and Oman ago, but I have to check with Tony on this. So you present a situation, you get everybody to interpret it, and then you show them how their interpretations are different. So in this case, you can see that green and blue, there's no way you can sit them down and have a conversation because they see the world in radically different ways. In that case, the only thing they're agreed on is they hate the red guys. The strategy here, and I'm going into, mustn't tell you where this is to make these extremes more extreme, so we create a new center. Yeah? You can see where this comes from in counterterrorism. We're trying to change the dispositional state so the extremists are more visible, and we got a consensus in the center. So I remember in the 1970s in Northern Ireland, when I was working on peace and reconciliation, after Bloody Sunday, if you were a Catholic, you let the provost go through your house. And it took us 30 years to recover from that. Yeah, because the minute a civilian population despairs of the armed forces actually supporting them, it's a catastrophic shift. It happens overnight. Yeah, and then it takes you years to recover. So that's kind of like the mapping. It also allows us, and a final slide, 2 slides on this and I'll finish. This is outlier mapping. We just did one on North Korea, where we did the BBC to create an infographic about the political situation in North Korea. We then distributed that to BBC foreign correspondents, foresight specialists, and people in government departments responsible for Korea, and we drew the maps. So we could show how different groups of people saw the world in wildly different ways. It also means, as you can see on this one, that this is the dominant way of thinking, but these people might be the 17% who've seen a gorilla. Right? Now this is distributed real-time decision support. Yeah, when we did one experimental deployment through West Point in Afghanistan, we had company commanders keep stories in return for not writing a patrol report. Yeah, so you basically create human sensors who you can ask questions of in real time. So you've got a distributed cognitive process to actually inform what you're doing. Yeah? And kind of like we can get even more sophisticated, this is a safety one. Yeah? This is actually, no, I don't think I'm allowed to tell you, it's a commercial one, sorry.
What was the finding on the DPRK outlier? What was the outlier's core thesis?
I'll give you an abstract illustration without betraying any confidence. It might, for example, be that the Olympics might be an intervention method. Right? You're trying to find outliers in complex positions, all right? And you can't do that by brainstorming, because the first people to talk influence what comes afterwards. This, by the way, is actually a really effective pre-red-blue, red-blue stuff, because you can see patterns before you get locked into the process. I mean, every time I've seen S2 challenge, it's not really a challenge because they're kind of like bought into the plan anyway. Yeah, it's at a subconscious level. So we're kind of like working around that. This is a safety one, so this is continuous monitoring. This is military, sorry, this is civilian, this is military. And what we've done here is we've had engineers keep continuous records on the factory floor in return for which they don't have to write shift reports. Again, that's, it's positive. And we can get weak signals. We did with water companies, we said you can take a picture of a pump, and the triangle was it smells wrong, it tastes wrong, it feels wrong. And we got 30 to 40 times reporting on that, and we got early indications of weak signals, because we allowed ambiguous data interpreted in an ambiguous way. Without allocation of blame, and that's actually quite important. Now the vertical dimension here, this is a probability distribution, this is rule compliance, this is job completion. So you can immediately see the problem in civilian, you either follow the rules or you get the job done. They're mutually incompatible states. All the questionnaires, all the focus groups say they're doing both because they know that's what they're legally meant to do. But the reality of day-to-day observations is different. Nobody on the board challenged this. Military, this looks really good, doesn't it? Until you look at it and discover it's nuclear weapons testing, which creates an existential quality to rule compliance and job completion, which won't translate to other contexts. You've then got get the job done, and you've got these guys who are just, what do I have to do to survive? Now, change here is about identifying that group and doing that shift. And this is called an adjacent possible. So you shift people to something close to where they are, going in the right direction, and this is a vector measure. And that's the other thing you also do with civilian populations in peacekeeping operations. You start to get the kids involved in capturing stories from adults through schools projects. You look at the underlying attitudes, then you start to shift the attitudes, because that creates a dispositional state. And this is a type of scaffolding which allows you to withdraw. Now, I've run through that quite quickly. Final point just to make, failure is more important than success in humans. We don't tell our children stories about how Dick and Jane stayed at home, followed the father's instructions, and achieved the family KPIs. We do the exact opposite. Right? Worst practice systems have more learning in them than best practice systems. And that actually contradicts what a lot of people think, but actually building stories of fictional or actual failure gives more learning. And the brain imprints failure instantly, but it may not imprint success. Because avoidance of failure is a more successful evolutionary strategy than imitation of success. So some of the work that Klein and I did with the Singapore Army, for example, on war games, this is human-mediated games over a day. is to set up a game in which, and this is human managed, not computer managed, because human beings are really malicious as game masters, in which whatever the teams do, they fail. It doesn't matter, whatever they do, they're going to fail. I mean, I watched Star Trek as a youth, so you can see where the idea came from. And constantly they record narrative, which they interpret, including what they're going to do and what they fail. After 3 rounds of failure, they're scanning 50 to 60 times more data before they make a decision. Whereas people who are trained in a game to succeed become complacent. Yeah? Right, so that's kind of like it. I've tried to give you a sort of high-level helicopter type overview of some of this stuff. But basically the whole concept is, what do we know from a scientific basis? Let's build methods and tools consistent with that. That way, we've got a better way of managing uncertainty. Any questions?
With the failure games, or did they ever figure out that there was no winnable solution and how?
Yeah, that's the secret. So we did this. I mean, we had one team of president scholars. If you know president scholars in Singapore?
I do not.
Okay, so they have an elite educational system, all right? So these are the elite of the elite. It's like the top 15 in Singapore. Yeah, and this is a nation educational system. So, I mean, Peter is a famous one, right? His first degree is mechanical engineering from MIT. His master's degree is cognitive psychology from Stanford, and his doctorate is philosophy from Oxford in the UK, and he does that in 15 years, all right? So these are scary guys, all right? The best and brightest go into the civil service, which is why Singapore is a successful state rather than industry, right? So either way, so we had a president scholars team, we had a bunch of NCOs, yeah? And another special forces team, and we set up a situation. Yeah, the situation we set up was invasion of Singapore. It's not called that. It's a standard training course in Singapore. It's called Gold Land and Red Land, and involves some red people. You know what it's about, all right? It's about China, right? So we ran that through, and the principle is they have half an hour to do a situational assessment. While they're doing that, we feed them disruptive data. We're monitoring what they're doing on the tables, and we're feeding them new data, so they never get a stable situation. At the end of the period, they have to say, this is what's happening, this is what we'll do. Then they go away for an hour, they come back, whatever they came up with turns out to have been a total disaster. It's very easy to do. You find something they missed, you create a scenario from it, you grin happily, they've all failed, and you repeat 3 times. And the key thing is it's happening to other people in parallel, so they don't take it personally, and they start to realize it's inevitable, and they start to scan more. Yeah, it's a very, very effective technique. If we really get clever about it, we actually bring in science fiction writers, and we create, if we're doing this on cultural change, or anything, to be honest, we create a planet, so we send in anthropologists to study the problem. We then create a planet which actually represents the culture of the company concerned. Then we land managers on the planet in a war game and see how they solve problems. Because they don't realize it's their own organization. It's deployed into a fictional space, so they explore stuff. And one of the famous ones we did for Poindexter is we created an alternative history of the US in which the South win the Civil War. I quite enjoyed that. We did it down in Richmond, which people said was biased. I think they wanted us to do this in a tent on the Mason-Dixon line, right? And we basically had, Lincoln didn't play the slavery card. That was a turning point. Yeah. So that meant the British and the French didn't get involved because that was a Confederate strategy, and we went through this whole scenario. It was quite fun, really. We had 15 historians. It was a lot of fun, all right? Yeah, Boston becomes a bunch of people who really want to be Europeans, but they never quite make it, so they're always trying to be European, yeah? California falls to Mexico, then falls to Japan in the Pacific Rim strategy, so Australia falls too. Canada becomes the dominant economic power because it holds on to the mid-plains and you don't get the genocide of the Native Americans. Yeah? Texas becomes a bunch of farmers who got rich too quick for their own good because they discovered oil, and somebody said that happened anyway. All right? And by the time we got to Kansas, sorry about this, we were getting into inbreeding. All right? Now, we then used that as a game environment. Well, we were having a lot of fun, right? John was great. He let you play with this stuff, right? What we then did is we used that. We took a current policy situation. We took an alternative history context. We put decision makers into the alternative history concept, not the one they thought they were dealing with, and they found solutions they would not have found if they talked about reality. Yeah, and that's kind of like modern approaches to gaming. Any more? I went on longer than I was meant to, so I apologize for that. Any more questions? Yeah.
So we're doing a series of war games, and we're focusing some on cybersecurity, some are physical, amphibious landings. We're studying the history of like polar and looking at the future conflicts that are coming up. What's a good approach for us to maybe create a vision or multiple visions for what a future operational context will be?
I'd actually create a few scenarios with, I'd take people like, if he was still alive, people like Ian Banks, but he isn't. We've got a pool of science fiction writers we work with, or more important, a pool of scientists who work for science fiction writers. If you actually go to a science fiction convention, which every intelligent person should probably do once in their life, but no more than once, right? You'll find Nobel Prize winning scientists arguing with each other about the things that they create, right? There's some really serious science goes into it, yeah? So I would actually deliberately create fictional scenarios and put people into war games in the fictional scenarios, yeah, again, with failure, so you increase the scanning, yeah? There's also attitudinal stuff. The stuff we've been doing with GCHQ this is with British government, so we're monitoring for attitudes to cybersecurity. And I make this clear, attitudes are more important than compliance. Because attitudes are lead indicators, compliance are lag indicators. And you can do this with combat readiness and everything. So what we've done there is we presented the Yahoo security breach as an infographic to every civil servant. They basically interpret it onto a set of triangles we developed with the cybersecurity experts in Cheltenham. And then they tell the story about why it couldn't happen here. We deliberately not chosen a government example because it would cause them to panic. And then they tell the story of what they would do if it did. And that's done in a half-hour pulse. This is a chaos mechanism, wisdom of crowds. So that allows us to draw a map which shows attitudes to security. We can mine the text for complacency, and we've got scenarios. Yeah, so what it does is it maps the space before we do anything in it. Yeah, so we don't start with how things should be, we start with how things are, and then we make changes.
You talked earlier about the tyranny of the explicit. I was just wondering if you could explain or tell your thoughts on how do you balance not being so authoritative in what you are going to do, but also not creating something that's so loose in a place like the military where it's just a list of heuristics that we're going through by, say, rules, order, and regulation.
I think it's a mixture. First of all, there's a whole body of stuff in human beings that takes 2 to 3 years to acquire. Yeah, so in Australia, let's take the example, they don't let kids drive cars with other than elderly relatives until they've been driving for 2 years. So they're not allowed to drive on a freeway, they're not allowed to drive at night, they're not allowed to drive with passengers other than their elderly relatives. The reason is it takes 2 years for the body and the brain to co-evolve to the point where you can drive and pay attention to a conversation. Yeah, accident rates among teenagers are huge because they haven't developed that capability. There's a body of knowledge which requires physical change as well as mental change, yeah? And you can't write that down. Yeah? So a famous thing is we always know more than we can say, we will always say more than we can write down. Yeah, the process of taking something from head to mouth to hands involves loss. Yeah? So we have a model we use called Ashen, which is how we map. So artifacts can be codified, skills can be codified. Heuristics gives you more ambiguity. Experience, you have to define what experience people have got to have, or what inexperience they've got. Yeah, because in some situations you don't want experienced teams going in because they're too pattern-based, you want naivety. Yeah, and then some people, are simply better at things than other people. Yeah, and we've got to get more sophisticated about this, right? The other thing is this control mechanism. The difference between doctrine and heuristics is key. Right? Because doctrine is fine, we need doctrine, we train people on doctrine. So I remember this, I got thrown out of the Pentagon many years ago, I probably shouldn't tell you this, guy, right? Because I basically said that what they were doing on the Army Lessons Learned program, which they make a big song and dance about in the conference market, but I don't buy, right? Because they captured stories in the field under fire. But what they then did is they reduced them to doctrine in Tradoc. And I said that won't work. And about 2 years later, Sorensen phoned me up and I got dragged back in. Because he said the only thing which worked in Iraq was platoon, that was a Freudian slip, in Iraq was platoon commanders blogging. And that's what I'd said. In the field under fire, people want fragmented real-time data. They don't want that data synthesized into doctrine because they know you've got loss. Yeah? So one of the ways we do that is with narrative databases. So, and that's how we use the high abstraction signification. Yeah? So actually, just show you quickly so it will make the point easier. This is the Libyan one. Remember I talked about triangles? Okay, so this is kids capturing stories in the street, right? What I can now do is I can basically say I want more of these and fewer of those. Right, now that's an operational system. That's sponsoring kids in schools to gather stories into an open access database, but then it becomes available to intelligence to look for underlying patterns. Yeah, and that's really powerful. It also means you engage with the schools, which is quite cute if you don't do peacekeeping as well. Yeah. Now that's also a knowledge base. So if I've got company commanders keeping continuous records, you can say, well, if I knew the solution to this problem, I put it somewhere up here. Then you find other stories told by other company commanders which were indexed the same way. And that's called managed serendipity. You're not finding things in a structured taxonomic way, you're discovering things at a high level of abstraction. And that's designed to create novelty or invention. Well, why are those things indexed the same way? You start to become curious. Yeah? And that's some of the ways we formalize it, because of course we can track those sort of uses, so we can still measure it. Any more?
We might have time for one more if anybody's got a safe round.
Doctor, what would you suggest as a premise for the slowest kid in the class to kind of catch on to what you were just saying?
First of all, I'm too old to ever believe the slowest kid in the class story, all right? I've been conned by that too many times, so I'm not falling for it, right?
Yeah, but anybody that knows that's true.
I think, first of all, I mean, there's a lot of video stuff on this, there's articles, but the best thing is to go and do something. Complexity is actually, we sometimes call it the new simplicity. It's actually really very simple, which is why I use the children's party story as an example. Yeah, it's like the narrative work. We find once people see narrative relevant to their own operation, they understand the concepts quickly, right? So we actually evolved to be natural complexity workers. It's just we trained ourselves not to do it for a long time. Yeah. I mean, there's some good books, Applying Sources of Power, which contains marine examples. I was with Gary last night. Yeah, he's doing some more work with you at the moment. I've written various articles, there's YouTube videos which people watch a lot, which I find embarrassing, but I don't want to watch them ever, thank you very much. Yeah? I don't want my daughter watching any more of them either because I get into trouble, right? So there's material on that. But what we generally find is it's better to do projects, all right? I mean, spending a couple of days with people, identifying 8 or 9 target projects, getting them involved in the projects, getting some experience. Naval Postgraduate School I've been working with for years, yeah, with Chris Bellavita and people like that. And they've created some quite brilliant stuff. I mean, the children's party story, they've translated into platonic dialogue with it using US military jargon. You can get it on our website. It's really very funny, right? It involves words like hot washes and stuff like that, right? And the way they work is multiple small projects, yeah, to gain experience. Yeah? And the last thing you ever want to do is do big projects. The basic lesson of complexity is stop doing big things and do lots of small things and learn from it.
Great. Maybe a hand for Dr. Snowden.